Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. This MP4 video has been recorded at full HD resolution of 1920 by 1080 pixels. So it should play full screen on Windows PCs, Apple Mac computers, mobile devices and also most modern televisions. Let's take a look at another example with this image here. Because when we frame up on a picture, all our camera can do, because it's such a dumb machine, is to take a series of exposure meter readings all around the frame and average them out. Well, I can do this myself using my image editor to help us. So with this image, taken on a very light, misty day, I'm going to remove the colour and I'm going to use Photoshop to blur the image. So what we're looking at here is much what our camera sees, because the camera being dumb, all it can see is the shade of colour. Let's now compare this to the 18% grey that the camera is calibrated to. And think about what we're looking at here. We're looking at a picture in that light area around the outer edge. So the camera is going to see that and think, wow, it's bright, I need to reduce the exposure here. But it would be clearly wrong, because then it's going to give us something like this, and I've just mocked this up using Photoshop, but in fact it could be far worse in other situations. Here we have the opposite end of the scale. We're in a rainforest, but here I will emphasize the fact that we're in pretty good conditions for a rainforest photo. It could be a lot worse if it was sunny or there was some sunlight filtering through the trees. But let's do the same thing. Let's remove the colour. Let's blur the image. Let's compare it with our 18% grey, and you can see where we're going here. The camera in the rainforest on a day like that would say to us, wow, this is dark, you need lots more exposure here. So instead of getting an image like this, we would get one like this, or as I said, one even worse, because you can imagine if there was some sunlight, it could be pretty awful. Every exposure we make is going to be a compromise. Our skill is making that compromise as small as possible. We need it to be small enough so that the camera's exposure meter can cope with it. We also need it to be small enough so our image editor can cope with it, but more importantly, we need it small enough so we can cope with it. Because if our skill level with our image editor isn't as good as what our camera can cope with and our image editor can cope with, then once again, we're going to fall short just a little bit. So when we're talking about exposure like this, the better the exposure, the easier the image editing, the quicker the image editing, the better quality the image editing, and you learn better too. It's wrong to say I captured the perfect exposure. Almost impossible to do. The most we can really say is we tried to capture the best exposure we can given the conditions and the subject we're photographing. Here's an example. Here we have a straight shot, which if you look at the little white panel on the left hand side is telling you that we've actually compensated the exposure here. One more stop of light has been given to this scene than the camera would have liked to have given. One stop doubles the exposure, of course. Now we can see that the effect on the foreground is pretty good, but the effect in the sky, not so much. We can see the reason why. We're shooting in contrasty conditions. Although it's getting towards sunset, the sun is still up there and it hasn't yet set, so it's still providing a lot of harsh light. The next example, if you look at that little white panel first, you'll see that this one has been given one stop less exposure. So here we've given half the exposure to what the camera wanted to give. The foreground exposure now is not so good. If I was going to try to raise detail from some of those rocks, that's when I'm going to start having some difficulty in doing so. But the sky is pretty good, even though there is just a tiny weeny bit of burn out there, but it's not significant. So here we are framed up on our subject. What we're seeing with our own eyes isn't what the camera has actually captured. So unless we've got really good control of our exposure, and if we were using automatic exposure, you can see how quick and easy it could be for the exposure here to be biased even darker than it currently is because of the brightness in the sky. And in that case, of course, we're going to lose the potential of a really good image. It's not possible in this situation to take one shot and capture the sky with the best exposure possible and the foreground. We've either got to compromise both, we've either got to bracket exposures, but of course some people turn to graduated filters. What I'd like to do here is to carry out a reflected light test. Now for this little experiment we can use any shutter speed, aperture, ISO. We can use automatic exposure or manual. It really doesn't matter at all. We're going to take a white card and a black card out in the garden on a nice bright day, and we're going to take a photo of each. Now I'm going to set the f-stop at f8. So when I frame up on my white card here, to get my little exposure pointer in the middle, the camera is saying to me, for this shot, you need 1/1000th of a second at f8. So I go ahead and I take my shot. Recognize the grey? Clearly we've got something which is well underexposed here because we're using reflected light. What do I need to do with my exposure to get my white card, when I take a photo of it, to turn out white? Well, in actual fact, I have to bias the exposure 2 stops. I'm doubling the light twice. So you can see I've gone from 1/1000th of a second first to 500ths of a second, which is 1 stop, then down to 250th of a second, and that gives us our 2 stops. But when we look at the white card at the top right, the camera is actually telling us the exposure is way off, but it clearly isn't. Now let's take the black card outside and do exactly the same. Remember, we're going to stay with f8 all of the time. So when I frame up on the black card, to get the exposure scale to be in the middle, telling me from the camera's point of view, all is well, take your shot, the camera is saying you need 1/60th of a second. But when we take the shot, we've got exactly the same shade of grey. Surprise, surprise, around about 18%. But rather than being underexposed like the white card, it's now overexposed. So what do we need to do to bring our black card back to black? We've got to compensate 2 stops in the exposure, but here we have to do a minus setting. So to do that, I speed up my shutter from 1/60th to 125th, and then from there to 250th, and we get the black card returned to black. But the exposure scale, bottom right, tells us we're 2 stops underexposed, when we clearly aren't. The thing we need to look at is the exposure we actually needed for both the white and the black card, because they're both the same, and of course they're both lit by the same light source. So had we taken an incident light meter reading, light falling on the subject, it would have turned out a lot better than it did, because the settings the camera chose for our white card and our black card here were both clearly wrong, because it's a dumb machine and we need to step in at times and make some adjustments. Here we have an image of a high contrast scene. It's very reminiscent of the two images I showed earlier on, where we looked at one exposure where we could expose correctly for the sky, but the foreground would go far too dark. Or we could expose for the foreground to get a bit of light in those shadows, but then the sky would be burnt out. Well, here we're in exactly the same position, and in fact this image is a result of two exposures very similar to the ones we viewed back then. There's at least 2 stops between the sky and the foreground here, possibly even a little more. The sun is still well above the horizon. If you look to the center of the image and just a little bit to the left, you've got 2 clouds on the left hand side. The one to the right, the sun was just behind there, and I think you can just about make that out because it's the lightest area in the picture. At the time that I took this picture, I was with another photographer. We both had our cameras on a tripod almost side by side, but I'd set up an automatic exposure bracketing so that every time I pressed a button I got 3 shots, one at the exposure the camera wanted to give, one stop overexposed, and one stop underexposed. In fact, I may have given it even a little more than that. The photographer I was with said or asked me what I was doing, and I explained I was bracketing, and he said he liked to get his shots captured in just 1 frame. Well, in conditions like this, that's not possible. And it's one of the things that we have to recognize with our cameras, that they don't always get things right. They don't have the same contrast range as our eyes do. So what we see is not, in fact, what we can capture. Now, I saw the image that the person I was with produced of this scene, and there was a large oval shape in the sky which was completely devoid of any pixels whatsoever. My one isn't, because what I've done is to spread the exposure over 2 frames. What is the alternative here? There aren't very many. We can do one of probably 3 things. We can bracket the exposures and use the exposure for the sky with an exposure for the foreground. We would need something like Photoshop to do that. We could use graduated filters, but I'm afraid they're not really my choice. I prefer to use exposure. But the only other thing we could really do would be to put the exposure right in the middle of the sky and the foreground. So in fact, we'd be compromising on both of them. Then we would have to rely on our image editing skills to try to balance the two. But in high contrast situations like this, that may not have been possible. The point I'm trying to make here is it doesn't matter what your skill level is, it doesn't matter how much you spent on your camera, there are some conditions where the photographer has to take over to ensure that you can walk away from the scene with the best possible exposure given the lighting conditions and the content of the image you're shooting. Now, here's a statement that I used to hear quite a bit, but I thought it was just about dead. But only recently someone came up with it once again. I don't approve of all this image editing. I like to show my pictures just as I saw them. That statement tells you the person speaking does not understand photography yet. But are they really certain they want to see their pictures just as they saw them? Really? Really? Okay. Then you'd have to live with this. It's an original image, complete with all the negative aspects our camera captured, because it's a dumb machine. You can have that on your wall. I'm going to manipulate it and put that on mine. Image editing is just bridging the gap, and it allows the photographer some artistic expression too. Here's another. You can live with this one if you want to, and I'll talk more about why this was exposed the way it is here a little later, but I'm going for this. And here's another. Golden hour shot. Doesn't look quite so golden, does it? However, the exposure does fall well within that exposure compromise gap I was talking about earlier on. So it's within the capabilities of our camera, it's within the capabilities of the image editor, and also the photographer. Hear that? There's another one of my pennies dropping. Now let's talk just a little while about the histogram. The histogram is just a guide. It's a graphic of the tones we have in our image. The dark tones are shown by the histogram on the left, light tones on the right, and mid-tones in the center. What we need to do is to learn the correlation between the histogram and either the image we're standing in front of, and we haven't yet maybe taken the image, or it's the image that's on our computer, because the histogram can be used in both. Now I think I know what some of you may be thinking. Could it be that I've paid a lot of money for my camera, I pay a lot of money for my image editor, I just want to go out and take pictures. I don't want to turn myself into a mathematician just to create a work of art. Now I've got some sympathy with that view until we start to understand that the histogram is probably our best aid to getting exposure right at the time we're pressing the button. It's also our best guide to get the image manipulated right in the editor. It's how we know we have all the colour, clarity and contrast that's available to us from within the image when we're manipulating it. And if you're a Camera Club member, you must have heard judges say this image lacks colour, clarity and contrast. Am I right or am I right? So the histogram is a guide, but it is a pretty vital one because of the reasons I've already said. The camera does not know if we're shooting an overly dark subject or an overly bright subject. If we look briefly at the histogram from these two images, with the black cat on the left, we can see the histogram all stacked up to the left. So there's no perfect shape we should be aiming for. We want to try to get the histogram from one side to the other, but of course if we're shooting a black cat in almost dark conditions, we're going to expect to see the histogram where it is on the left. When we look at the cat on the right, if the cat didn't have such a blue background and it was a lot whiter and brighter there, then we'd see almost a mirror image of the histogram on the left. But even so, we can see things are stacked up to the right. Let's have a little bit of fun with the histogram. Not entirely fair to be looking at a histogram here, isolated from the image, but we'll see the image in a moment. So, was this exposure a mistake or correct? What are we looking at here? We're looking at all the dark pixels stacked up on the left-hand side, a little bit like our black cat in a coal cellar. But we can also see a little peak up on the right hand side. See that little sticky uppy thing on the bottom right corner, showing us that we've got quite a bright spot of white or brightness in the picture. So, mistake or judgment? When we see the image, there's that oh yes moment, because the photographer here knew what they were doing, compensated the exposure, so the exposure correlates with the histogram, and we can even see what's causing that little spike over on the right hand side, and it's the windows probably up at the top there. This is an untouched raw file, so I hope you'll agree the exposure here is a pretty good place to start any manipulation. What about this one? Stacked up on the right hand side, has a bit of a gap too. Was this an error by the photographer, or was it again judgment? Well, once again it was judgment. Here we are, we're shooting a white cat in the snow. Well, perhaps not a white cat, but the same type of image. The histogram is exactly what we would expect to see when we're viewing this image. And that's what I mean when I say we have to learn the correlation between the two. How do we do that? Well, if we just take images and look at the histogram often enough, it just comes naturally. It's nothing you have to work hard at to learn. It really is quite simple. You just need a little bit of time. What about the picture that goes with this histogram? What can we tell here? Well, once again, we've got lots of shadow areas in this picture by the look of it, because the main histogram is stacked up on the left, but we do also have a huge spike on the right hand side. So was this a mistake, or was it compensation by the photographer? Well, we've had two that were right, so you'll probably guess that this one not so good. Now I'm sure you can tell this yourself, but just to reassure you, the bright areas in the center of the frame, in the wheels and on the floor, is so burnt out there's no pixels there at all. So we've completely lost detail, and when you think of what we saw in the histogram, the image matches the histogram. So here we can say the photographer made a big mistake. Only the photographer didn't make a big mistake, because the photographer here knew this was going to happen, because the knowledge of exposure had built up to a level where he could look at this scene and say, I'm going to have problems here, I need to step in and do something a little different. And here it's a little bit like the seascape. It's so harsh, the light, that we needed two separate shots, but when we put them together, it's not an absolutely dramatic picture, but it does tell the story pretty well. If we recognize these things while we're still standing in front of the scene with the camera in hand, we've got the chance to do something about it. When we're sitting in front of a thumbnail on our computer, too late. Here I brought you back to that image which I exposed for the shadows, but I said I didn't allow the highlights to take care of themselves. We can see the histogram that goes with this image, so we can see the histogram looks pretty good. We don't have any peaks on the left, we don't have any peaks on the right. You can actually see by my text at the top that this was a deliberate plus one stop exposure to get the raw materials that I wanted to create the image that comes next. So when we capture the best exposure we can, when we capture an exposure to the right, or we are squeezing as much light into the sensor as we possibly can, but without losing any of the highlights, not only does it make the image editing quite easy to do, the quality remains high, and this image would print certainly 30-40 inches without any difficulty at all. And of course, if you were learning image editing, that previous unmanipulated raw shot would be a great one to learn with. Now it's your turn. Well, not yours if you're watching this on video, because I did this for my own photographic club. But what I did was I took a look at judges' comments on 3 images that were submitted to the Camera Club's competition over the past number of months. I didn't want to embarrass anybody, so I'm not actually going to show the images. I just want to show the histogram and the comments that went with them. Here's the first one, and I will add that all three of the images that go with the three histograms I'm going to show here were all good images. I think from memory they all scored 8 points each, so they did pretty good in Camera Club competitions. But this is the first one. The image would benefit for some clarity, contrast and exposure. Now I've opened up the image into Photoshop, bearing in mind I'm not seeing the original RAW file, so I can only look at the levels of the image that was submitted. But we can see clearly exactly why the image would benefit from some clarity, contrast and exposure. We can see a deficiency on the right hand side. All I needed to do was to drag in that pointer to the edge of the histogram. I moved the left pointer in just a fraction to the right, and the image almost leapt off the screen. The contrast, the exposure, the clarity were all massively improved. So here I'm suggesting that the author got the exposure just about as good as they could at the taking stage, but they fell short when they were taking their images through, or this image through, the image editor. Here's the next one. This has been captured in subdued lighting, which lacks good contrast. Some basic adjustments in image editing software like Photoshop or Lightroom would make a lot of difference. The judge here was absolutely spot on. And once again, I just needed to move that left-hand slider in a fraction to the edge of the histogram. A little tweak of the mid-tone slider, sometimes called clarity in Camera Raw, and once again this image leapt off the screen. So if it scored 8 points and was quite deficient in the editing department, then it could have scored 9, may have even scored 10. And the final one of the three, something's gone wrong with the processing and the scene looks very flat and underexposed, and once again the judge was absolutely right. And when we look at the histogram, we can see why. All we need to do now is to move that slider in from the right into the edge of the histogram, and once again the image is improved 200%. It looked great once I'd made those changes, but of course they would have been much better to make those in Camera Raw or Lightroom. Now whenever we're manipulating our images, we should be looking at the histogram, because in all three images the exposure looked to be pretty good. So the histogram that would have helped is the one in the image editor. So when you're working in Adobe Camera Raw, it's sitting up at the top right looking at you all of the time. When you're working in Lightroom, you've got exactly the same. So you need to use the histogram as a guide, both at the taking stage, and we're going to come to that next, but certainly in your image editor. So coming back to a picture I showed earlier on, what's wrong with this? Well, nothing at all in my view. It's been exposed to the right. So I've exposed for the shadows and I've allowed the highlights to take care of themselves up to a point. But where is that point and how do we make sure we don't step over it? Now this image looks fairly bright because I've exposed to the right quite a large slice here. But it was shot into a rainforest, and if you saw the actual scene itself, it would be much darker than this, and perhaps if you look down at the bottom at the settings used, you may appreciate how dull the conditions were, because just to be able to get 125th of a second at f5.6, and I think we was using a 400mm lens here, the ISO had to be at the maximum my camera can give me, which is 1600 ISO. Now you can see from the histogram in the middle, the histogram is pretty good. So if we were saying from every scene we want to leave it with the best exposure we can possibly get given the conditions and the subject, I'm going to suggest I've got that here, because I've got scope now to take this picture anywhere I want. Also, I've shot this at very high ISO. The very first thing you need to do to avoid excessive noise in high ISO shots is never to underexpose the image, because if you try to raise even a little bit of detail from shadow areas of a high ISO shot, there's likely to be lots of unpleasant noise comes along for the ride. Now, cameras are getting better at this as time moves forward, but it's still the best policy. High ISO, do not underexpose, because we want to do all of our editing from light pixels towards dark and not the other way round. Now you may need to put your fingers in your ears, because there's another one of my pennies dropping. Most cameras will allow you to view the histogram on the back of your camera. And this is how you learn the correlation between what you're shooting and the histogram, and after a while your confidence will build. So you walk away from most of the scenes you're shooting with the confidence you've got the best exposure that was able to be captured at that particular place. Now, with some cameras you can also set something which is often referred to these days as the blinkies. So what happens on my camera and many others is that black area will be flashing on and off on the back of the camera for the time the LCD shows you a preview. That black area is telling me that that area of the sky is overexposed to the extent that I'm losing detail completely. So here, if I took my shot, it's telling me, whoa, overexposed, give it less exposure. So I take another shot and I give it less exposure. Now I've got far less of the blinkies flashing on my LCD, but still a little bit too much for comfort. So I drop the exposure again and I take another shot. Now I see just 3 little tiny areas flashing away. I know now that is my line in the sand. When I talk about exposing for the shadows and allowing the highlights to take care of themselves up to a point, there's the point. Because those 3 little blinkies are insignificant. But what they are like a little beacon to me, because they're saying you've squeezed as much light into the sensor as you're going to get away with here. Any more, and these blinkies are going to be a bit more than you can possibly handle. So this is one of your best assistants for getting exposure as good as it's possible to get. So there will be plenty of times when we need to expose for the shadows and squeeze as much light into the sensor as we possibly can. But we can use that histogram on the back of the camera to tell us exactly where the line is. Because if we're trying to protect the dark tone pixels in the image, we don't want to go a step too far and then start to affect the light tone pixels. Then all of our editing is going to be done from light towards dark, and we know that that ensures the best possible quality given the conditions, and in this case it also does a pretty good job of suppressing noise. So with a shot like this, exposing to the right has done me quite a few favours. It's given me the opportunity to have a fair degree of scope in the style of image editing I want to create, and it's also allowed me to subdue that noise. If you look at the right claw of the bird, not our right, the bird's right, I'm going to enlarge this image because most times when we start to increase the ISO of our camera, we see most of the noise in the outer focus skies or backgrounds. Now you can see the claw of the bird up on the right, top right corner, so it gives you some context of scale here. So we're looking at an enlarged background, and even here at 1600 ISO, we're not seeing any evidence of noise. So what have I been saying here? Well, quite a number of things, I think. Certainly exposure remains the holy grail of photography. It certainly is the key to good and consistent images. It certainly ensures image editing is easier and quicker to do. The histogram on the camera's LCD and the histogram in image editors like Photoshop or Lightroom are going to help enormously. Better exposure makes learning image editing much easier. Better exposure takes the guesswork out of your photography. Your image quality will be difficult to beat. Thank you for watching, and I hope the video was helpful in some way. Don't forget that I do produce a monthly newsletter, and that also contains at least one video on a photographic subject. And we also have a dedicated photo forum at www.beckhamforum.com.au. Why not come along and join us?